In today's video, I'm going to be talking a little bit about my own approach to a secular Buddhist path. That is, what secular Buddhism means to me. Coming right up. I'm Doug Smith of the Online Dharma Institute, that's onlinedharma.org. If you're new to the channel and interested in living a wiser and a kinder and a calmer life, consider subscribing to the channel and click the bell down below if you want to receive notifications of new videos when they come out. Also, if you would like a deeper dive into the Dharma of early Buddhism from a secular perspective, but also, frankly, I do try to give traditional perspectives as well, check out my courses on the Online Dharma Institute over at onlinedharma.org. So I'll actually return a little bit near the end of the video to this idea that I have of trying to bring both secular and traditional approaches to my videos, both on the Online Dharma Institute and here as well. Because that's part of actually what my own view of a secular path is. So when I designed this channel, when I first thought about this channel, this YouTube channel, trying to come up with a name, the reason I called it Doug's Secular Dharma is because I don't want it to be anybody else's, in the sense that this is only my own view. This is only my own view of the secular Dharma. Other people will have other views, and that's fine. Indeed, other people will have other views of the Dharma, and that's fine. We all have our own approach. We all bring our own approach. And so what I'm hoping is that my approach can be general enough that it's appealing to people even who are traditional believers, because I'm going to be talking about all of these options. In my general view, a secular approach should be a broad tent. It should include people from different backgrounds. It should not be exclusivist in that regard. The general idea, however, that encompasses all of this is that Buddhist practice, that Buddhist philosophy and practice, the Buddhist approach to life, is an approach to life here and now. It's an approach to this life. And yes, of course, there may indeed be other lives that happened, that we had in the past or that we will have in the future, but those are speculations. Those are possible and possibly not. But for now, what we know is we have this life to deal with. And so what we're aiming towards is a practice that we can use in this life to make this life better, to make ourselves wiser, to make ourselves calmer, kinder, more compassionate, better, healthier, more skillful. As Bhikkhu Bodhi has said, he says that the supreme goal of Buddhism is the liberation of mind by non-clinging. And that supreme goal is the sort of goal that I think we can all accept, whether we are traditional believers or whether we are believers interested only in a practice for this life. That is to say, we're aiming towards a goal of non-clinging, and we're trying to find practices that allow us to relax around our ordinary clingings to things in this world, whether they be views, and many of these issues I'll be dealing with in today's video are really around views, particular viewpoints that we have. And so the Buddhist practice is one of understanding that we have certain views, but we should relax around them. We shouldn't cling to them. We shouldn't crave them too much. We should understand that we could be wrong, and a traditional view could be correct, or that a traditional view could be wrong and a secular view could be correct. Either of these is a possibility. And so from our own perspective, we sort of relax around our viewpoint. Among other things, we use the Dharma as a raft, as the Buddha says, to help us cross over, but not to cling to. Now, I think one way of illustrating different approaches to a secular path in Buddhism is to look at some distinctions between my own approach and others. In particular, perhaps the most famous person in secular Buddhism, the person who has done the most to popularize it and get it out there in the front of the public, is Stephen Batchelor, who is a wonderful writer and thinker and was a traditional monastic, both within a Tibetan context for many years and within a Korean Zen context for many years. So he has a deep understanding of the Dharma from many different perspectives, traditional perspectives. And it's Stephen Batchelor's approach to the Dharma is to say that in his way of understanding it, the Buddha was really not interested in beliefs per se. He wasn't interested in fostering or fomenting certain kinds of beliefs. What the Buddha was interested, for Stephen Batchelor, what he was interested in was in practices. So in us doing certain practices, meditative practices, other kinds of practices, and that beliefs really weren't important for the Buddha, according to Batchelor. Now, this view, I think, of Batchelor's, this approach to the Dharma, I think comes from Stephen Batchelor's background in a Tibetan context in which the Madhyamaka view is very prominently taught. The Madhyamaka view, which is really a deconstruction of our viewpoints from a philosophical perspective, so that views are not to be taken totally seriously. Our concepts are not to be taken totally seriously because they're all empty. And from within a Zen context as well, where again, concepts, views, ideas, beliefs are all to be considered problematic in certain ways. They're all misleading in certain ways. And so we should strive in our practice to leave them all behind. These are, I think, essential parts of both certain aspects of Tibetan and Zen approaches to philosophy and to life, is to make the practice really primary and the viewpoints become empty and become things that are problematic and that we can leave behind. And coming from that standpoint then, of course, the difference between traditional beliefs about rebirth, let's say, and secular ones sort of dissolve, because these are all things around beliefs and views can be, in a sense, left behind. Now, Stephen Batchelor also has another approach, what we would call a hermeneutic approach or an interpretive approach, which is to say that the Buddha's views on rebirth, let's say, were things that he picked up from the society around him 2,500 years ago in India. They were ideas that came from the culture. They were not original to the Buddha. And so, from Stephen Batchelor's perspective, since they weren't original to the Buddha, we can leave them to one side. They weren't what was really original about the Buddha's teaching. So, from Stephen Batchelor's perspective, the parts of Buddhism that we should really care about and be most invested in are the parts that the Buddha truly originated, that truly came from him alone, and that didn't come from the wider society. Before I get to my own views on all of this, though, I would love to just take a moment to tell you a little bit about Patreon, because Patreon is how I help to support this channel and help to keep it advertising free, that is, outside advertising free. And I have various ways that you can join on Patreon. If you're interested perhaps in an audio-only version of these videos of mine, I can set you up for that over on Patreon. If you're interested in seeing the videos early, that is, to have a sort of a view beforehand of these videos before they come out to the general public, you can also get that over on Patreon. So I hope you'll take a look at my Patreon website. It's linked down below. And if you're interested, sign up. And if you're not, that's fine too. Now, turning to my own view of the secular Buddhist path, the secular Dharma, it's important to me to not be antagonistic towards those of a traditional mindset. I think we're all practicing towards the same goals, the same goals of non-clinging, of non-attachment. We're all practicing towards the same goals of generosity, of kindness, of compassion, of calm, different meditative practices of calming ourselves. These are all the same practices, and to my way of looking at things, they're all directed at the same end, that is to say, an end of non-clinging, of non-attachment. And so therefore, it's simply not a good idea, it's not healthy, it's not skillful to be looking to foment differences with traditional believers. Not to say that we shouldn't say that there are differences, of course there are, and of course many people, perhaps you yourself, many people are traditional believers, and a traditional approacher, people who approach the Dharma from a traditional perspective. Each of us has to find our own route, and some of us prefer a traditional route, and again, that's fine. I've got nothing against that. So that's one aspect of my own approach to a secular path. But to get back to Stephen Batchelor, I look at things slightly differently from Stephen Batchelor. Stephen Batchelor likes to say that Buddhism is not about beliefs. But I think from my own perspective, if I look at the early texts, I find the early texts full of beliefs that the Buddha not only said that he held, but that he said that we should hold. Beliefs such as that all things change. That is a belief that we find in early Buddhism, that that there is no permanent self. That is another one. There are many such beliefs that the Buddha had in early, that sense pleasures are dangerous. This is a belief that the Buddha talks about over and over again. So that's one aspect of it. Another aspect has to do with where the Buddha's ideas came from. Stephen Batchelor says that the Buddha's beliefs about rebirth came from the wider society. That certainly is true. They were not original to him. However, the Buddha had many beliefs that came from the wider society. It seems as though his practices came from the wider society too, such as the practices of the Brahmaviharas, that is, the practice of loving kindness and compassion, and sympathetic joy. All of that was not original to the Buddha either. The Buddha talks about, or the early texts talk about, people from other belief systems also practicing the Brahmaviharas. So those were not original to the Buddha either. And indeed, many of the meditative practices of renunciation were also not original to the Buddha. They were in the wider society of renunciants in ancient India. So there are many, many aspects of the Buddha Dharma, the Buddha teaching, and the Buddhist practice that were not original to the Buddha. But yet, I think we ought to hold them as Buddhist, as central parts of belief and practice. So the mere fact that some of his ideas may have come from elsewhere does not mean we shouldn't take them seriously. Similarly, there are other great thinkers who grew up in a wider societal context, but such as, let's say, St. Thomas Aquinas, who was, of course, a great theologian in the Christian tradition, Catholic tradition. All of his ideas of Christianity came from the wider society, and indeed his ideas of Aristotle came from the wider society too, and what he did was to meld the two. He melded Christian theology with Aristotelian philosophy. That was his great advancement within theology. But those came from the wider society. But I think it would be a mistake for us to interpret Thomas Aquinas by saying everything that wasn't original to him sort of isn't important, because none of it really was original to him except the synthesis. So I think we, at least from my point of view, the fact that a lot of stuff was not original to the Buddha doesn't mean we shouldn't take it seriously. So it seems to me that at least perhaps, this is one possible way of looking at it, that Stephen Batchelor's approach and the approach of some other secular Buddhists is sort of, seems to be built around a sort of what I would call a suppressed premise. That is to say, there's an argument here, and there's one premise that we aren't really attending to because it hasn't been stated openly. And the premise is that the Buddha was somehow perfect. And that the Buddha, that is to say, he agreed with everything we agree with. So that the things that seem to us imperfect in the Buddha's teachings, again from a secular perspective, either weren't original to him, or were things he didn't agree with, or were things that we can leave to the side, so that we're ending up with what the Buddha is really expressing are things that we agree with completely. Again, thinking of the Buddha as kind of a perfected being. And that's a reasonable kind of position to hold, because in the early texts, certainly he is portrayed as being a perfected being, not only in being perfectly wise and having given up greed and hatred, but in being sort of a superhuman. Now, my own view is slightly different, and this will be controversial to some people. My own view is that the Buddha was an ordinary person. That is to say, he was not perfect. He was perhaps perfected in certain ways. That is to say, again, he was perhaps somebody who had given up all greed. He was somebody who had given up all hatred. He was somebody who was completely wise, in as much as we can determine wisdom to be. He was somebody who completely understood the Four Noble Truths. These are the kinds of things we can say about him, perhaps. But that doesn't mean that the Buddha was knowledgeable about everything. It doesn't mean that the Buddha was omniscient. Indeed, it is completely compatible with the Buddha being wrong about certain things, again, in my own viewpoint. So my own viewpoint is that the Buddha was a historical figure, that he was exceptionally wise, and that's why I think he is legitimately the sort of person that we should be teaching much more nowadays, wiser than almost any historical figure that I know of. In fact, I would say wiser than anyone that I know of. But if we look at the other great wise people of the past, people like Plato, like Socrates, like Aristotle, like Confucius, like even people like Newton, who was an exceptional mind, who had an exceptional mind, these people were not right about everything. They made many, many statements that were erroneous in the light of modern understandings of things. And that's fine, because ancient people who lived a long time ago don't have the knowledge we have nowadays. But that doesn't mean we should consider them any less wise for that. And indeed, many traditional believers will even say that it looks as though the early Sangha was, let's say, sort of anti-women, that there were many things that were done in the early Sangha that were negative towards women's viewpoints there. And the Buddha himself seems, at least from the information that we have, perhaps to have been somewhat hesitant about letting women into the Sangha. And so if we want to update this to nowadays, we may indeed say that we should be much more invested in a feminist kind of approach if we're going to really bring the Sangha up to date nowadays. So at least in my view, we should strive as much as possible to be objective historians of the Buddha, of early Buddhism. That's what I tried to do in one of my courses. And that's, of course, an impossible thing to do completely. None of us can be completely objective, so we will all have our own viewpoints to bring to the material. But we do our best. And what we find if we do that is a fascinating and complex character, is a real person, is somebody with an extraordinary amount of wisdom, but also some perhaps minor faults that we can see, minor imperfections or things that we might disagree with, that we can update now to a contemporary viewpoint, at least if that's how we like to approach things. And I think particularly interesting, we can, to a very large extent, preserve the heart of early Buddhist metaphysics. That is to say, the three marks of existence, that all things seem to be changing, that all things change. That is something that's compatible to an extremely high degree with all that we understand in modern science, and modern physics, and modern chemistry. Now, of course, in modern physics, it's sometimes stated that there are certain elementary particles that may exist for eons and eons, and so if we want to get really careful about these things, we may find ways that Buddhist metaphysics is not quite in complete harmony with certain aspects of contemporary physics, but it's very close. And certainly the Buddha wouldn't have known about any of that anyway. What he was caring about was things that we saw around us in daily life. So all things change, that all things are to an extent unsatisfactory. There's nothing there that would disagree with modern science, that we can't perfect things. Or the last one, that there isn't a permanent self, that non-self is the way we should look at the world, that self is a kind of construct. And this is perhaps his deepest and most correct kind of viewpoint. It's something that we find in neuroscience. It's something we find in cognitive psychology. That when we look for a self, what we find is an enormous amount of construction, of self-construction, of a constructing of an idea of self, of a sort of a manufactured self out of concepts of a self. And that these concepts and this conception of a self can wax and wane. And in certain kinds of illnesses, it can go away completely. And in certain kind of mental states as well, it can go away. And so that is something that I think is deeply profound in the Buddha's teaching. And I have a video on these three marks of existence I'll put up on the screen here in case you want to know more. But having said all of that, the most important thing for the Buddha was practice. And here I come back into a really fundamental agreement with Stephen Batchelor. That is, that the deepest parts of the Dharma, the deepest parts of the Buddha's teaching, what the Buddha really cared about was practice. Yes, there is theory. Yes, there are beliefs that the Buddha put across, but he put them across for a practical end. That is to say, we should believe these things because they, if understood in the right way, can make our practice better, can make our lives better, can make us more skillful in the world. Once we understand that things change, life becomes easier for us. Once we believe certain things, we can practice with that in a better way. And I have an earlier video about a secular Buddhist practice, a secular Buddhist sort of view of practice. I'll put a link to it up here on the screen. I think it's a great thing to pay attention to. I hope this has been useful, and I hope we'll catch you on the next one of these videos. And meanwhile, all of you, be well.